Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Political State. I'm Ben Felder with the Oklahoman. Joining me here in the Oklahoman studios, Dale Denwalt, Capitol reporter, and Chris Castile, who's been up to his neck in election coverage for several months now, right?
Yeah, it seems like it.
Yeah, and we, speaking of those elections, we are now less than 2 weeks away, about 10 or 11 days, something like that, away from the big primary, which is going to set the table for November elections or force what we expect will be quite a bit of runoff races later this summer in August. We're going to talk about those elections. We're also going to talk about some news out of the state Supreme Court this year, some state questions that are coming to the ballot this month and in the future. But let's start with those elections, and let's start with the top of the ticket, really. That's the governor's race. We've talked about that a lot over the last few months. I mean, this is the home stretch, and I'm curious, what is it that the candidates, particularly the big three, so Lamb, Cornett, Stitt, I mean, we've consistently kind of agreed that those are really the three that are in the running. And one of them is going to be on the outside looking in. But what's the focus for these candidates as they're trying to appeal to last-minute voters? Quite a few who have been undecided, at least according to polls, right?
I think you have to keep doing what you've been doing, which is appealing to all of the conservative instincts of voters. We know for sure who these voters are. They're, for the most part, Trump supporters, which we could probably argue all day whether that makes them conservatives or not. It's sort of hard to figure out what a Republican or conservative is in the era of Trump. But I think that for the most part, except for one, they're anti-tax. They've got to get that message through. You look on all their commercials, and it's proven conservative, conservative Republican. That's the the image they're just like trying to hammer into this primary electorate. We've talked about it many times before. It's a very conservative electorate. You can't think of a Republican primary in terms of what you might think of the entire state electorate. It's who turns out on that day. They're conservative Republicans for the most part. That's why they keep trying to appeal to that. They're on the air almost to saturation point. They're still hitting a lot of kind of meet and greet type things where they raise money, and so they're still doing what they've been doing for a year, actually, just with more TV.
Yeah. You get to feel, do you feel like this is really an issue-based campaign, or is this kind of a conservative beauty contest still at this point?
We've tried to make it an issue-based campaign. I mean, that's mainly what I've been trying to cover is the issues on this. And they've done a ton of forums, and it is an issue. Those are issues. Those are about issues. The same ones over and over for the most part. Taxes and the budget. I mean, they've spent a lot of time answering for things that the legislature did, which they can quite easily say, well, I'll do better. Yeah. But I think the biggest issue has been education and the budget mess at the budget chaos at the Capitol. That's the recurring thing. Every single forum features a question about the budget.
Yeah, but as you said, most of those questions have been, what would you have done?
Right.
And not so much forward looking. I mean, I know you're asking those questions and others are, but and we've said this before in previous episodes. In a way, the legislature did these candidates a favor, by passing that tax agreement. They don't really have to legitimately ask whether or not they would raise taxes in the future. I mean, they've been asked those questions, but there's not an expectation that that's going to be on the table. I mean, the tax hikes that we've seen, have raised the bar even more that we would see, right, Dale? I mean, that's essentially at the Capitol that we're probably not going to be talking about tax increases next legislative session, barring some kind of disaster.
And if anything, we will see a shift toward some of the more traditional Republican and conservative talking points about auditing what's going on, fiscal conservatism. The pendulum swings both ways, and I think it's going to swing pretty hard the other way next year and the years to come.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't know how much we've reported some a little bit about polls, and those are always kind of a tricky subject depending on what polls you're relying on. The candidates have their own polls, and sometimes they leak that information out. But I mean, Chris, what's your sense on kind of what this horse race looks like right now? I mean, is Lamb still kind of in the lead with followed by Cornett and Stitt? Do you have any sense that there's been any kind of movement in that kind of perceived ranking?
I think it's a little bit fluid among those three. I mean, I have heard about internals in the last few weeks and the polls that the candidates do themselves, and they can change from week to week and who's in first, but and who's battling out for that second spot in the runoff, and it assuredly will be a runoff in this GOP gubernatorial primary. Any of the three could wind up. You've got all this undecided to break, and what one campaign was telling me was that, well, Lamb and of the undecideds, Lamb and Cornette have high favorables. You know, so all the undecided will break to one or the other. But I have a hard time with that, actually. I think a lot of that undecided is going to break towards Stitt as well.
Well, and I was kind of surprised to hear you say that. I mean, to say that they were saying that Lamb and Cornette, because you know, Cornette and Lamb are kind of known names. Known. I mean, Lamb more known than Cornette, you know, statewide. But these are still kind of somewhat household names if you're watching politics. And Stitt is kind of the newcomer. And so if you can't decide between the two kind of more prominent names, it seems like Stitt.
You know what's odd about, and the other thing that's odd about it is that I actually can't see if you are like worried about issues, or if you worried about where these guys are on things. You know, for the most part, they're pretty aligned on traditional like guns. They both say the same thing on guns, and Medicaid expansion, which is a story I'm working on. But Cornette has left himself a lot more open on taxes. You know, he's a lot. And nobody really knows where he is on some of this budget stuff, and I think that's by design. I think he is purposely not saying what he would do in certain things. So I almost have a hard time believing that people could be torn, because Lamb is so clear about where he is on everything. So I have a hard time believing that well, I'll go with the clear guy or the unclear guy. I think Stitt is in the mix for a lot of people who are undecided, really. You know, I think they'll also, but you could, easily in this race wind up with somebody, two people in the runoff with, 25% of the vote.
Yeah.
You know, you've got 10 candidates in the thing. I mean, Blake Cowboy Stevens, or he might get 2%. You divide up all the rest of that. Divide up votes among 10 candidates. You're probably going to wind up with the top two people around 25, 23 or something.
Yeah. It's interesting because whoever advances on the runoff, assuming that there's going to be one, I mean, there's going to be several candidates on the outside looking in, obviously, that aren't going to make it. But of these three, and not to say that the other candidates, some of them don't feel like they have a legitimate shot or aren't trying as hard as they can. But with these three, you're going to have somebody who's on the outside looking in that probably right today thinks, I could possibly be the next governor. If you're either one of those would be that case. And what's interesting to me is when the runoff happens, you're focused on just two candidates, and the differences are pretty stark. No matter how you organize it around. If you have Lamb versus Cornette, as you said, you have Cornette who's been more of a moderate, and you have to imagine that Lamb is going to start to really hit him hard on some of those positions.
The runoff campaign will be entirely different than this has been. This has been a very positive campaign so far. It's really just bio stuff, here's how I'm trying to project myself: Secret Service agent, outsider, successful mayor. None of these guys have gone after the top three.
Yeah,
they do it. They make little comments during forums and public appearances, but their references are not even by name. You just kind of have to know who they're talking about when they say it.
Yeah. Yeah, and it makes sense that once you get to runoff, you have two candidates, the intensity gets ratcheted up a little bit. Maybe it does go more negative. But especially now, because you're right, if you've got Stitt and Lamb, now you've got an outsider versus an insider. I mean, the weakness of your candidate is going to be so glaring, and it's going to be what these candidates are going to try to focus on. In the run up to August. So when we get a runoff, who knows? Maybe we'll be surprised. But with so many candidates running, and once again, we're talking so much about the Republicans on the Democratic side. I mean, it just really isn't much of a story right now. I mean, Edmondson is
I think Edmondson's campaign was probably deliberating maybe like 2 or 3 weeks ago. Do we do any TV? I mean, do we just hoard all the cash that we've got? And they have not bought any broadcast time that I've been able to find. So I think the decision they made was, we're going to win this pretty easily. Don't need to spend any money to do it. We'll just do a bunch of social media in the run up to it, and so it looks like they're pretty confident they'll win easily over former State Senator Connie Johnson, who had almost no money.
Yeah. Well, Chris, last week's episode, and you weren't with us, but Dale, Justin, and I, and Representative Emily Virgin was on the show, and we spent our time talking about non-gubernatorial races and just some of the ones that we thought were kind of the most interesting, particularly at the legislative level. I was just kind of curious, you've kind of been focused on the gubernatorial race, but you've been covering a lot of other races as well. Is there a House or a Senate seat that's also, kind of high on your interesting to watch on election night?
Only a couple of like the open seats, just because there's so many candidates, or their candidate might be interesting for some reason or another. But I was talking to an incumbent Republican last week who would seem to have his hands full. I think he's got 4 or 5 Republican primary opponents, who's very confident he'll win without a runoff, which and he was an anti-tax. You know, he voted against the tax increase. So I think that I think some of those races will be interesting to watch. You know, not only the ones who voted against it, but then the whatever leadership people have primaries too. You know, I mean, most of these people will probably emerge fairly unscathed in these primaries. But if any incumbents get pushed into a runoff, those are going to be interesting races between. In July and August, those will be interesting to watch.
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, incumbency is powerful. I mean, the incumbent usually wins re-election. This year, some people wondered if that would be the case because of a lot of voter frustration from the legislature, and maybe that does translate into some incumbents losing. But at the same time, we've also seen a lot of incumbents just not run, right, Dale? I mean, we're going to see a lot of races where we saw some kind of surprise announcements over the last several months.
That's right. I forget the total number, but it really is surprising when you go back and look at how many from this last legislature aren't coming back next year, even though they could, even though they still have time left on their term limits. And I think it's entirely possible that they sat down with a consultant and saw that maybe the numbers didn't look great, maybe they were losing some support from donors, and that may have figured into their decision not to seek re-election. I think for several, it's probably not the only reason. I think the frustration of it all, and the fact that a lot of them are young adults, quite frankly, who have young kids at home, and I know they can probably be a hassle for someone who has to be at the Capitol, 6 days a week, trying to figure out a budget. And so I think that their re-election chances probably played some role for some of them, played some role in their decision not to come back.
Yeah. Well, and we're going to see so many. I mean, obviously, we'll talk about next year as we get closer to next year, with the primaries to worry about, and then the general. But either way, there's going to be a lot of new faces. We're going to see a new governor. We're going to see a lot of other new positions, a lot of changeover in the legislature. And even if the balance of power doesn't change, which it's probably not going to, I mean, even if Republicans continue to have their wide majority in the House and the Senate, and there's a Republican in the governor's mansion, that still doesn't mean that it's going to be business as usual next year. I mean, we've seen in recent years that even within the Republican Party, there can be lots of different disagreement in the direction that things go. So, I mean, one way or another, there's going to be quite a bit of change in 2019.
And Speaker McCall has frequently said that he does what his caucus wants to do. And with so many new faces, it could change the outcome of what a GOP House policy looks like going into next session.
Yeah. Well, one of the issues that a lot of candidates have been having to answer is the education, as you mentioned, Chris, particularly the teacher pay raises that are being funded by a series of tax hikes, which are being challenged. And we saw some news out of the state Supreme Court. Was it this week? Man, it seems like forever ago. Was it earlier this week?
The oral arguments were.
But I mean,
Monday.
When they heard,
right.
Monday. It sounds.
Yeah,
it
we're
like
sitting here waiting
forever ago.
Waiting for a decision from them on this petition.
So we don't know the decision at this moment, but give us a recap of what we saw on Monday.
I was going to say, I will. First, I was going to say when you're talking about races to watch is all the teachers that filed.
Yeah,
and that'll be something to watch in this round of primaries. There's multiple teachers in some races. There are multiple teachers in some primaries. There are teachers running against teachers. So I think if we could get a good handle on that in the days afterwards, maybe how many teachers emerged from that first round, at least. I think that'll
the counts are there's about 50 current or most recently of this last year teachers, and almost 100 that have some kind of connection, whether to education, whether they're a principal or used to be, or maybe retired 10 years ago. But you're right,
which would be almost a quarter of the legislative candidates that filed, because there were 460 or something that filed for the legislature.
And so much in 2016, there was a lot of focus on the so-called Teachers Caucus, and there were 32 candidates that were running that were teachers or had just recently left the teaching profession. Only one or two, I think it was two, were successful in that race. So a lot of them, are running as Democrats, so they have that challenge, especially if they're running in a red district. And a lot of them are new. I mean, so it's very hard. But in this, I don't know. Maybe the playing field is a little bit more even in some of these races. If you had the incumbent decide not to run again, if you have a lot of other new faces, a lot of the intense focus on education, I would say that the atmosphere, the climate is better for a lot of those first-time candidates who are teachers this year than it was in 2016. Whether that leads to a wave of elected teachers remains to be seen. But you're right, there are some races that have teacher running against teachers.
Yeah, I think they're in that one that I did where it has 12 candidates on the Republican side. I think there are 3 teachers in that.
Yeah. So it makes for an interesting campaign. So I appreciate you mentioning that back
on the Supreme Court. Yeah, they. Oklahoma Taxpayers United is an anti-tax group that formed. They're backed by former U.S. Senator Tom Coburn. They've been circulating a petition. They need 42,000 signatures. They want to get a statewide vote on repealing the tax package. That was approved by the legislature in late March, signed by the governor. It's some oil and gas production, the GPT tax, motor fuels, cigarettes, and little cigars. And the original package included a new hotel, motel, nightly stay tax that wound up being repealed in a separate bill. So two challenges were filed to the petition itself, both by education groups. One to the use of the referendum process. It's a rarely, most of the time when a group goes out to get something on a statewide ballot, they use the initiative process. This is the referendum process, which is rarely used. It's only the 25th time it's ever been done in the state of Oklahoma, and it's used primarily to repeal a law, that has been passed by the legislature. So the question is, can you use, what the question in this challenge is, can you use the referendum process to repeal taxes that fund a vital state operation? The tax package was connected to a teacher pay raise, even the teacher pay raise bill even refers to the. So that's the question, because the referendum petition process has an exception in law, in the Constitution. You can't use it for something that's vital to the state's peace, health, and safety. Public peace, health, and safety. Professional Oklahoma educators are arguing that education is vital to the state's. So they're trying to convince the Supreme Court that you can't even use the referendum petition process to repeal this tax package. I don't think the justices were really persuaded by that. The Chief Justice said, well, education's not in the Constitution specifically in reference to this referendum petition process, and the teachers organization or the professional educators are trying to argue, well, you just carve it out as an exception. And that's not something that justices are inclined to do. To take a constitutional provision and basically write something into it, So that was kind of the essence of that first challenge. Can you even use this process? The second one is, if you can use this process, is this petition good enough? Because it doesn't mention two of the taxes, the summary, what's called the gist of the petition that they're circulating. It only mentions the motor fuels, the cigarette tax, and the gross production tax. It doesn't even mention the change in little cigars, and it doesn't mention anything about the hotel, motel, which is a confusing mess because they wound up repealing it. So it's not mentioned in the gist. So the question is, well, was somebody signing this petition, do they even know what they're signing? Do they even know what this bill is? Or are you misrepresenting this bill by not including those? And the other requirement with a referendum petition is that you include an exact copy of the law that was passed, exact. Well, the one that they attached to the petition for people to read if they're interested in reading the entire law doesn't have like the page numbers of it doesn't have the section numbers of the bill 1010. So if you're like trying to refer to a different site, you can't find it. So the people circulating the petition admit the defects. Their position is they're not fatal. People still know what they're signing a petition for. So the justices didn't seem to buy that. The Chief Justice was like, at best this thing is sloppy. At worst it's misleading, and deceptive. And that's not a good sign for their side. For the circular side and the Chief Justice. And there were a lot of comments along those lines. The Vice Chief Justice said, we're trying to protect voters here. So it could happen that when the court rules, maybe late this week, early next week, I would think that they'll get kind of a split decision that they'll say you can go forward, but you need to file an amended petition because this one's just too flawed. Well, the clock doesn't change. They would be under the same deadline, July 18th, to gather 42,000 signatures on a new petition. So in essence, they'd have probably a little more than a month, about a month. File a new petition to repeal the tax bill and get 42,000 signatures. That'd be a tall order.
It's this debate. It's almost like fighting over the Apple user agreement because it's important. Don't get me wrong, but most people don't even pay attention to it. And regardless, I mean, as someone who's observed a lot of, I don't sign these petitions, because of my job, but often if I'm asked to sign a petition, I'll ask plenty of, I'm almost kind of the petition signature gatherer's worst nightmare, because I want to ask a lot of questions about what it's about. I'm just kind of curious what they know, what they've been told, because a lot of times these people are just being paid to do it. These are not like the advocates out there trying to get it.
Right.
And so after like 5-minute conversation, I declined to sign. So, but most people, when you observe, there's like a 5-second pitch, and they say yay or nay. And and they sign, just like with the Apple user group. You say yes, but here we are. It's important though to fight that. So what are the scenarios we could be looking at here, depending on how the court rules and moving forward, particularly as we get ready for this tax to be collected?
Well, it could blow another huge hole in the budget. If you remember last year, getting close to about this time last year, the Supreme Court, in a very quick order, quickly after they heard the oral arguments, rejected the cigarette tax and blew it can't remember now, but over $200 million out of the budget that the legislatures had to deal with and be in special session for, and I think it could very well do the same here. This is earmarked money. It's not going to be their legislatures are going to have to come back and reappropriate a bunch of agencies because it's directly tied to the teacher pay. But ultimately, what happens, I don't know, except for the fact that there's going to be a lot of people who are upset that they're not going to have the money to have the raise, the teacher pay raise.
And that's there's some real world implications for schools and districts, stuff like that. But we're talking about the politics on this show. If you're a legislator running for office, right now, a Republican lawmaker who just got done making a really tough vote in favor of the tax hikes, you're probably not wanting to come. They're probably all not wanting to come back for any reason to the Capitol. But the idea of a special session to fill some kind of hole, whether that means they have to come and I don't know what the scenario would be. There's talk now that the budget's doing better. The revenue projections are up. I don't know if they would come back and try to say that we think we can float it. I don't know. It just seems like there's so many different scenarios that would go that just get complicated given the fact that we're in an election year, right?
And just to clarify, if the Supreme Court rules that the petition can go ahead, can advance, the way I understand it, that would essentially freeze the money. Is that right? And it wouldn't necessarily say that you can't spend.
That's one of the AG, the Attorney General's office, was asked to give its own views of both of these challenges, and as a neutral party, they did so. And one of the things that they said to the Supreme Court is you need to clarify this question.
Yeah.
When you rule on this, you need to tell people right now what effect the petition itself, as it's in this process, is going to have on teacher raises.
Yeah. So we're waiting to hear that.
We're waiting to hear that.
Yeah.
So that should be one element of, if they let the process go forward, then they're going to have to say, this legally freezes that money for right now.
Yeah. I have to imagine there's some candidates, particularly some candidates for governor, who have said they would not have signed that tax, but are hoping that it remains and survives. Probably.
My guess is that and it's just a guess, that the majority of Oklahoma feels that way. I would have a hard time if they got this on the ballot. I would think it would fail, because I just don't even think that people want to mess with this anymore. I think they just want to be done with it. Let's don't have another 2 years fighting over tax hikes. This one passed, governor signed it. Let's just live with it and move on.
And you can't. And I think
because there would be a lot of if while that's on the ballot. Imagine the weeks of campaigning up until then.
Yeah.
Of teachers and educators and other of their support warning what would happen if it were repealed, and everybody's going, oh gosh.
Yeah. And I don't think that we can just assume that the electorate, a largely conservative electorate, would just vote against taxes because they're anti-taxes. I say that because I go back to 2016. There were some kind of low-hanging fruit, red meat for some conservatives when it came to religious, the Ten Commandments, and and then criminal justice, and voters seemed to take those things seriously and thought through it and didn't just cast a vote. The religious or the Ten Commandments state question failed, and so it wasn't like this. These red meat state questions didn't seem, and I'm characterizing them as that, but weren't just gobbled up. The electorate seemed to really kind of think about these things, and I think it would be the same way with this. That
you had a majority of Republicans in both houses approved that tax increase, and a Republican governor signed it. I mean, I think it's all the evidence you need that Republicans aren't uniformly against this tax package. They're the ones who approved it.
Yeah, well, and
it's
we have
their package.
Yeah, and we have some races that you've referenced too that'll be interesting. We have the pro-tax and anti-tax Republicans running against each other. It'll be interesting to see how
that is going to be interesting.
How that shakes out. Well, before we wrap up, let's we've got a state question coming up. We also have another state question that's going to be coming up later. Dale, down
this year. That's right. In November, Oklahoma's going to get to vote on whether they want to be able to visit the eye doctor inside a store like Walmart or Target or the new Costco going up on the north side of town. You wouldn't imagine that there would be a huge debate about it, but there is. And the people who are against it are the optometrists in Oklahoma. They're right now they're concerned that they could lose the integrity of the practices that they run. So if Walmart comes in and hires an optometrist to work in their store, it's going to be a little bit different than going to a private practice and visiting with a doctor there. The people in support of this state question say that it's going to be it's going to be the same service, only it's going to be cheaper because there are certain ways that you can build in cost-cutting measures when you have a big box store like that, or you sign a contract with a provider who's got 100 optometry clinics across the country, and what I think the optometrists who are against State Question 793, they're worried about competition. They're worried about a Walmart optician or optometrist selling services cheaper than they have traditionally in the past.
Yeah. How much is, Walmart and big box stores influence? There's been a lot of that in trying to shape law, liquor laws.
Yeah, it's the same group, the same group that pushed for the modernization of Oklahoma's liquor laws. Same group that's pushing State Question 793.
Yeah. Well, maybe a year from now they'll be pushing for doctors who can prescribe medical marijuana in Walmarts as well, depending on how the state question goes here in a couple weeks ago. That's the only state question, right, on the ballot the next couple of weeks. Yeah. This one will be, you referred to as in November.
That's right.
The optometrist, but the medical marijuana.
The only one on the June 26th ballot.
We have any idea how we feel like that's going to go?
I think it's going to pass.
Same. Yeah, I think it may be close, but and we've heard the opposition have spent some money on ads. Chris, you were saying you haven't seen any ads. I don't watch TV, so I wouldn't know. Unless they start putting ads on YouTube or something.
I haven't seen a single ad. They bought the anti-group has bought like $450,000, I think, worth of TV time, but maybe it's not hitting the right channel at the right time.
Yeah. At this point, it may be a little too late. What were you saying?
Think about who's going out to vote in this primary election. For the most part, it's going to be Republicans, right? Because you have more Republicans in office defending their seats than Democrats, right? It's probably safe to say that there are more Republicans. I haven't checked the numbers, but maybe more Republicans running for office than Democrats. Is there any sway that you think that a conservative Republican electorate who is turning out more than the Democrats this election would sway the outcome of this vote?
It's an absolute unknown. Everybody in every campaign is wondering the exact same thing. So it's hard to even poll it. Right? Everybody is really wondering how this is going to affect. I think in general, since you have more Republicans vote, but you also have a lot of independents in this state, and it's that category has trended. And those people, the independent voters, can vote in the Democratic primary, and I think there'll be a lot of them.
Yeah, there will be some people who come out just to vote for the state question, but I think that's a great question because on paper you would think that would give it an uphill climb. That you have the most conservative voters are coming out in large force for this primary. A lot of religious conservative voters may be inclined to vote against it. At the same time, I've heard the argument made that you have an older electorate too, and that's a population that always think
both of those things are true in the Republican primary.
But there's the thought is that within a certain segment of the older population, that medical marijuana is seen as actually a viable tool in combating a variety of ailments.
So how would you classify an anti-medical marijuana voter? What do they look like?
Well, an anti?
Yeah.
What did you say?
James Langford. or
he is,
the head of the state chamber. I don't know what they look like, but I'm not sure you can generalize about them.
I mean,
I think there are a lot of Republicans that are going to vote for.
Well, I would characterize it as kind of a younger conservative, evangelical that is only looking at this through in their eyes what they see as a morality issue, not looking at the benefit or possible benefit of mental. I mean, if you're a younger person, that's not necessarily and younger people suffer through ailments and stuff to where this could be beneficial as well. But you may not be looking at through those guys. But if you're, I'm not an expert in this topic, but I mean, if you're a potential customer, and I think there are plenty of, there's not a partisan issue in terms of people who struggle with illness or disability or pain or whatever it may be. And I mean, we've seen the cannabis oil kind of explosion across Oklahoma. It's a little different, but I mean, so I don't know. It's I mean, if you just came to Oklahoma for the first time and looked at our political stats, you may say, oh, this probably fails. But there's a lot of people that seem pretty optimistic. That
so many states have done it.
Yeah.
I can't remember exactly what Oklahoma would be. What 33rd or 34th state to, or is it even more that already have medical?
At least half.
Medical.
Yeah, more.
It's in the 30s
that,
or even close to 40 by now. So, I think there have been a lot of kind of lab tests in other states for this, and we got a border state that's full recreational, Colorado, and more states are going that. I mean, this is. A lot of people would say this is actually recreational. Some of the opponents say this is actually, there's no really rules for this. Anybody can get a prescription, smoke pot, or eat pot, eat marijuana.
Yeah, and I'm not saying this endorsing or opposing this issue at all, but the argument that's been made that this is, you could just go into your doctor and get a prescription really easy. And I'm like, well, have you seen how we've been handling pills? I mean, this would not be the first treatment that I had an injury last year and felt like I needed some pain medication, and I was really worried that I was going to have to be on the stand to try to get some medication from my doctor. I figured they'd be just very scrupulous, and it wasn't. I got 3 words out and I got the prescription.
Well, you were asking Dale about are they going to have to come back into session really quickly after if this passes?
Yeah, they have 1 month after if it passes to put regulations in place. The Department of Health is already working on
1 month.
Yeah, yeah. But 1 month after it passes, if it passes, they're going to have to start handing out licenses to businesses wanting to get into this industry. And they're working on it. There's already drafts of legislation sort of tucked away in someone's drawer at the Capitol. But I don't know. One reason why I think that it probably has a fighting chance of winning. The opposition can spend all the money in the world, and I don't think they're going to sway anyone who is voting for it. They might get some undecideds, but I think for the most part, everyone who would be against this is already going to the polls. It's already going to be there to vote. And I think the medical marijuana campaign, their strategy is to get people to the polls.
So you feel like the anti-thing could actually do themselves harm by blitzing that? I mean, because
no, I don't know.
I mean, is that?
I don't think they could do some harm. They'll pick up a few points here and there from the undecideds who just haven't heard any opposition yet and would be tempted to sway because of it. But I think if there's one place where the pro campaign would be in trouble is if they can't get people out to vote.
Yeah.
There is, I think there are probably more people who would support something like this who traditionally aren't voters. Young people, minorities, especially in Oklahoma. Those are people who tend to vote less than
more progressive
than senior citizens who are white would tend to. So. I think the challenge for the pro campaign is to actually get people to the polls, and that's what these last couple of weeks are really important for, is get out the vote campaigns.
Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting to see, and if it does pass, I mean, the clock starts. It's going to, just throws another wrench into the legislature that I'm sure you'll have fun covering. So
yeah.
We'll see what
I can't wait to get back.
Yeah. So, and no decision from the Supreme Court, but the moment we do, whether it's, I guess it could be, would they do something this late on a Friday afternoon? I guess they could, or
I don't know.
Early next week.
I would think, the time of the afternoon may be, sometime before 5, I think it's probably still possible. But early next week, I would think would be the latest it would go.
Well, either way, newsok.com is your place to go for the latest on that. If you're listening to this podcast later this weekend, check out the Oklahoman for any potential results out of the state Supreme Court. Well, with Chris and Dale, I'm Ben with the Oklahoman. Thanks for joining us this week. We'll be back for another episode of Political State from the Oklahoman. See you next Friday.